Hello and welcome to Chapter 5, Civil Rights from the American Government 3rd edition textbook from Open Stax. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about civil rights. So we'll go through certain parts of in this country, how civil rights came about for various different groups such as African Americans, Native Americans, the LGBT community, and women and other groups. So just touching base on the difference between civil liberties and civil rights. So civil liberties are limitations of government power designed to protect freedoms, and civil rights are constitutional guarantees that the government, and of course and all government officials, will treat people equally, regardless of whether they belong to a protected class such as race, gender, ethnic origin, and religion. So just here to picture of female cadets on the left-hand side from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, of course, allowing the first female cadets to graduate in 1980, and of course Citadel didn't allow actually women until 1995. So the Equal Protection Clause. Equal Protection Clause is of course based on the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868 that specifically states that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. No state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Of course, that means that all people are treated equally. However, as we have seen throughout this country, that was not the case for a lot of groups. So we can see here, after the Civil War, a lot of individuals from the South were very unhappy at the freedom of African Americans. You can see here a school that was built by the federal government for formerly enslaved people was burned to the ground of a riot in Memphis, Tennessee in 1868. Riots like this, such that happened in Memphis, Tennessee in 1866, and others continued throughout the decades after slaves were free, African American slaves were freed. So this didn't really stop until the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, and that continued on of innocent African Americans being terrorized by individuals who were not happy at their freedom. So discrimination, what is that and how is that defined? Discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different people, different categories of individuals based on race, age, or sex. So discrimination effect results in different treatment of similar individuals. And of course, a law has a discriminatory purpose when it is enacted with the intent to unjustified treating people. So individuals after the Civil War, there were laws in place, discriminating laws against African Americans when it came to voting and education and what locations and public places they could eat. So they had discriminating factors, and of course in this country they didn't allow women to vote until 1920. So there was a lot of factors that allowed individuals to be discriminated against based on law. So you can see here a memorial engraving, the 1865 Abraham Lincoln resting on a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. So equal protection involves the principles equality, fairness, and freedom from discrimination. So when a law discriminates, what that means is when a law discriminates, the courts have to look at the purpose of discrimination practice and deciding if the law is constitutional. So of course, individuals must look. The courts have played a huge factor in discriminating laws to ensure the protection of individuals. So laws involving discrimination against protected classes, again, protected classes meaning race, religion, or national origin, receive the highest level of scrutiny and are thus often found unconstitutional. So if any law is prohibiting discriminating against individuals' race, religion, national origin, the Supreme Courts will also look at that as scrutiny and vote that as unconstitutional. So here are 3 levels of scrutiny. Rational basis test, right? Rational related to the legitimate government interest. Standard used by the court to decide most forms of discrimination. So there has to be burden of proof that demonstrate there's no good reason for treating them differently from other citizens. Intermediate scrutiny. So standard used by the courts with gender and sex discrimination cases. Here, the burden of proof is of the government to demonstrate an important governmental interest. And the strict scrutiny, this standard used by the courts to decide cases of a discrimination based on race, religion, ethnicity, and of course, national origin. And if here as well, the burden of proof is on the government to demonstrate compelling government interest. Affirmative action. Well, what is that? So it consists of government programs and policies designed to benefit members who have historically been subject to discrimination. So what this affirmative action means is basically implementing policies in place to assure that groups that have been historically discriminated against are not discriminated against. Now, affirmative action is not the law or a policy that states that groups that have been historically discriminated automatically obtain a position in a company or a position in government. No, it just makes sure that there's policies in place to make sure that any group that has been discriminated against does not continue to get discriminated against, and making sure that those policies are in place. So, of course, these were to address inequalities with long-standing discrimination factors of particular individuals. So, of course, most programs are targeted towards education and employment opportunities. The Reconstruction Amendments. So after the Civil War, it was a period between 1865 and 1877. It was a period known as the Reconstruction era, during which the governments of the Confederate States were reorganized prior to being readmitted into the Union. So the Reconstruction eras were attempts to prevent states from enacting black code laws that prohibited former slaves of the rights and liberties. So between 1865 and 1877, the federal government had troops in the South to assure that slaves were not being deprived of their rights and liberties. The 13th Amendment. So what is that? That basically states that ended the long-standing conflicts between slaveholding and non-holding slaves, basically abolishing slavery. The 14th Amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the states where they reside. So this amendment has actually come into more under the scrutiny of the light, not because in today's age, not because of African Americans or the slavery that happened prior to the Civil War, but because of immigration, whether regards to if an individual is undocumented in this country and has a child here, is that person, if that person is a natural born citizen, even though their parents were undocumented. That has been called into case of whether or not that should be tested on the 14th Amendment. Despite the protection of the 14th Amendment, the courts upheld several discrimination laws. Of course, the courts have not always been perfect. There has been cases where the courts have been wrong, but of course they do eventually look at their wrongs. So in one of the most famous cases of Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, the Supreme Court allowed separate but equal racial segregation under the Equal Protection Clause. Basically, this was a floodgates of opening what then became known as the Jim Crow laws, promoting racial segregation and undermining black voting rights. So this case of Plessy versus Ferguson was the floodgates of discriminatory laws in the South. That is where you see the signs of black areas and white areas when it came to public places, and of course discrimination in schools as well, having separate schools, separate buildings, or such. The Jim Crow era's laws sought to disenfranchise minorities, especially African Americans, meaning a revocation or impediment of individuals' right to vote. So, of course, in order to disenfranchise African Americans from voting, they had several ways of doing some disenfranchising practice, including literacy tests that required a prospective voter to read a passage of the text and answer questions about it. So, of course, illiterate whites were often allowed to vote under the grandfather clause exceptions because they meant that, because their grandfather voted, they could vote. So understanding tests, including reading passages and explaining them or answering questions about U.S. citizenship or U.S. history, poll tax, they had to pay in order to vote, and white-only primaries that excluded minorities from participation. So you can see here a copy of what the poll tax was. So once that was paid, then they can vote. Segregation often refers to the system of laws and practices that keep different groups apart. De facto means the results from private choices of individuals, and de jure, segregation results from government discrimination or laws that foster segregation. So the Plessy standard was separate but equal accommodations. So of course, but segregation laws and practices were strongly benefited white individuals. So just a review question, just for you to think about. You can write it down or think about it for a minute here. What is the difference between civil liberties and civil rights? So continuing on to civil rights and discrimination of African Americans during the Jim Crow era, of course, after the Reconstruction era. You can see here, once separate but equal was found unconstitutional by Brown versus Board of Education. You can see here in the 1957, there was opposition of black individuals integrating with white students. So President Eisenhower called in the 151st Airborne Division to assist escorting 9 African American students to and from school in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas. You can see here the march, again, one of the most famous marches during the Civil Rights Demonstration, 1965. The African American Civil Rights Movement. So after World War II, there was, again, a heightened discrimination of black individuals, even though, of course, they served in the war. And of course, this led to a huge civil rights movement. So one of the first important cases of the civil rights movement was the Brown versus Board of Education. This was, of course, allowed that separate but equal was unconstitutional, but of course did not end segregation schooling overnight. Many of the states and school districts fought desegregation orders for the next 2 decades. So it took a long time for segregation to end at public schools. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed government discrimination and unequal application of voting qualifications by race. So this also expanded to individuals allowing the outlaw segregation by most businesses that were open to the public, including hotels, theaters, restaurants that were not private clubs. So hotels, theaters, and restaurants used to discriminate against black individuals either by not allowing them in or having different areas for whites and blacks. And of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 found that in the Constitution that they could not do that. So we saw that going on. And of course, the Civil Rights Act also prohibited this discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, and sex. So we started seeing the creation of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce this law. Here you see 2 individuals during the Civil Rights era who had fought for the rights of African Americans in 2 different approaches. This is the only time the 2 men ever met. So Martin Luther King on the left and on the right, Malcolm X. So the impacts of the Civil Rights Movement. African American Civil Rights Movement was both a legacy for past civil rights struggles and influence on future movements. So this was only the beginning. And of course, this also led to the influential movement for Native Americans, Chicanos, and Latinos, LGBTQIA plus individuals, and immigrants. So the Civil Rights Movement sparked not only the African American community, but also other groups. Another battle that happened was the women's suffrage movement that began actually in 1840s, which would have given the women the right to vote. Some Western municipalities and territories and states allow women to vote in local elections, but it wasn't the women's right to participate in all elections. This was, of course, until 1911 and 1920. So, of course, just because the Constitution says that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied, it didn't expand for women, and this had to expand to women. So, of course, you see here a picture of 1917 of the suffrage movement of women. See another picture here. So, Native American rights. So, Native Americans were forcibly, unfortunately, Native Americans who were here first in this country also faced discrimination. Back from in 1830s, known as the Trail of Tears, Native Americans were forcibly removed from the eastern United States and had to walk all the way to what is named present-day Oklahoma. So these individuals came from all over parts of the South and were forced out of their land. So in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act granted citizens to all Native Americans born after this passage. Older Native Americans who had not secured citizenship through the military service became citizens under the Nationality Act of 1840. The U.S. courts repeatedly declined to extend many constitutional liberties, such as the rights to reservations through its Fifth Amendment. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 extended the reservation of many civil rights liberties granted under the Bill of Rights. And of course, in 1973, the American Indian movement occupied Wounded Knee, demanding the federal government honor past treaties which it failed to perform its obligations. So, of course, that is probably one of the most controversial topics amongst Native Americans and white individuals here in this country, is that when white individuals promised on certain things to Native Americans, they were often betrayed, and you continue to see the expansion out westward. Other significant movements other than African Americans and, of course, Native Americans, we saw most Asian Americans were excluded from citizenship and naturalized citizens until the 1940s. During World War II, Japanese Americans in California were interrogated and put into internment camps to assure that they would not plot another attack. Of course, there was no evidence to show that individuals living in California during that time had plotted with Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. Latino and Chicano groups continued to advocate the civil rights workers and the pathway to nationalize for undocumented workers. So going back to the Trail of Tears, you can see here, starting, of course, the forced removal of Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Greek, and Seminole from the southeast part of this country. You can see here that they were moved to present-day Oklahoma. And many Native American individuals died on the passage on the way to Oklahoma. So you can see here two individuals, very famous, known for the Native American rights. Another significant movement, of course, the women's rights movements began in the 1960s for medical autonomy and privacy. And of course, we also saw earn equal pay and of course, combat social discrimination. Immigration rights groups have sought to prevention of human trafficking and increase pathways to immigration. So you can see here a picture of Japanese Americans being displaced in their homes by the U.S. government. So the show shows from a picture from North Carolina during 1946 and 1968. The sterilization performed by the state in each of the counties of North Carolina between July 4th, 1946 and June of 1968. Another group that continues and did fight for their rights, of course, is the LGBTQ plus rights community. What has been called as the gay rights movement arose in the 1960s, targeting discrimination laws, criminalizing same-sex marriage and acts. Until the 1960s, all states criminalized same-sex acts, most prohibited appearing in public in a manner that was damned to must align with people's sex assigned at birth. So, of course, we see here that there has been several Supreme Court cases regarding the LGBTQ plus community. A review question for you. If a person's religious beliefs conflict with a law or are led to bias against other groups, should you be government protected under the exercise of those beliefs? Why or why not? So think about that for a minute and write down your questions on a piece of paper.